welcome everyone, our diehard, redoubtable audience members. Welcome again to our JET BAMS Academic SIG Special Interest Group event. I think this is this the third, or this is the third event that we've had so far. We do these about every 6 weeks, I think, so probably the next one will be in September, and hopefully we'll line someone up for that very, very shortly. But nevertheless, today we have Dr. Christopher P. Hood from Cardiff University in South Wales. Chris is a very old friend of mine. We actually met because of the JET program, so that was a sort of a fortuitous and a good thing for me, at least. Hopefully also for Chris. Chris is a reader in Japanese studies at Cardiff University. He's the author of Japan, the Basics, Osaka, A Chronicle of Loss in the World's Largest Single Plane Crash, Dealing with Disaster in Japan, Responses to the Flight JL123 Crash, Shinkansen, From Bullet Train to Symbol of Modern Japan, and of Education Reform in Japan, Nakasone's Legacy, which was based actually on Chris's PhD thesis. And I remember very much while Chris was doing that, I was also, and slightly after that, I was also doing my PhD at Sheffield at the same time. And we had many enjoyable times during that period. Chris is also author of 2 novels, one of which I've read, about the Tokyo Olympic Games, or at least set with the backdrop of the Tokyo Olympic Games. It's called Hijacking Japan, Tokyo 2020. Oh, actually, is it 3 novels, Chris?
It's 3 novels now.
Yes, it is. Yeah, sorry. Hijacking Japan, Tokyo 2020 Vision, and 4 in capitals. Today, Chris is going to be talking to us about the title of his presentation is 2 Tribes United by Music, Western Pop in Japan. I'm very much looking forward to this. I've not heard about any of this research from Chris, so this is the first time for me, at least. If you want to write any comments or questions while Chris is talking, just put them in the chat box on the right-hand side, and we can deal with them when we come up. Hopefully we can all unmute ourselves, or I'll unmute everyone at the end, and we can have a good conversation. There's probably a good number for us to have a decent chat. Okay, so Chris, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Peter. And obviously, I'll start off by thanking Peter for inviting me to this talk, and also thank you to others in the interest group for their organisation, Keith, Charlene, and others. For those of you who may not have been to one of these presentations before, one of the central characteristics has been the idea of autoethnography. It's been a theme of the previous presentations, and is going to be a theme within this presentation as well. If you're not familiar with this term, in brief, it's where we, the observer, are also part of the group which we are studying. It is perhaps an unusual approach usually in academia, and dare I say, even one that some would say should be avoided. But I would argue that the personal is often within our research, even if we like to pretend that it isn't. So Peter's already started introducing some of my books, and you're going to find throughout many of my slides here, I put in QR codes in case you want to quickly scan and get to relevant pages for additional information. So I would say that personal opinion comes into our books all the time in some form, especially now that publishers like you to write in the first person. But more than this, you can get drawn into the subject. As for me, as Peter mentioned, I chose my PhD topic, and which became the first book, on the basis of my JET program experiences. And there have also been personal driving courses for all of my other research, even if I wasn't setting out to study or learn more about myself at the beginning. For some reason, once we start talking about media, there is a need to be more careful. Perhaps this is because there is a danger that the interest or hobby will come to dominate the subject matter. I've tried to avoid this with my research on disaster movies and aviation, which includes elements of pop culture. But many seem to struggle to hide their interests in aspects of pop culture or find a reason why someone should read about it if they're not actually a fan of that particular aspect. But rather than discuss disaster movies today or pop culture on airplanes, I'm going to be talking much more about pop music. And if we're going to study such an area, then the obvious thing to be thinking about and the obvious act to consider is, of course, AKB48. How many essays have I, and I'm sure Peter and others have had this as well, how many essays have we read about AKB48 over the recent years? Yet I have very little interest in them, little awareness of any of their songs, and so they're not for me. Someone like Namie Amuro, on the other hand, is much more my kind of music. And as you can see from the photographs on the right, I could even do a link of a study of Amuro to my work on aviation and content tourism. In fact, I even gave a passing mention to her in one of the previously mentioned publications. But it's still not really something I could or want to get my teeth into, particularly since I have very limited interest in Okinawa, which is where Amuro is from. Another musician potentially worthy of study is Kyu Sakamoto. He's particularly interesting because he's the only Japanese act to date who has topped the charts in America, albeit with a very bizarre renaming of the song. And of course, there's a link to my work about the JL123 crash because he was one of the victims on board the plane. However, I wouldn't particularly call myself a fan of his music. Some of his songs are okay. And so I'm not really sure what I could do to study him, which would really contribute to academic studies or anything. And rather than Kyu Sakamoto, my media studies research related to JL123 has related much more to the novels and dramatizations related to the crash. Now, along with Princess and a few other acts I am too embarrassed to mention now, Rebecca is much more my kind of Japanese music. Rebecca was actually my introduction to Japanese music back in the 1980s. And I think I have all of the group's albums, and I also think I have all of Noko's solo work. I even used the title of Rebecca songs for the titles of the chapters in the aforementioned novel Tokyo 2020 Vision, set around the Tokyo Olympics, and I did a quick amendment to the book soon after it's published to now take account of it starting today rather than starting about 12 months ago. But still, I can't think of how I could turn or use my fandom of Rebecca into something that's worthy of study and people would find interesting. And then I stopped to think about the issues a little bit more. And I thought the crux of the problem here is assuming that if you're going to study pop music and Japan, that you should be looking at Japanese acts. And here I think it's helpful to employ what I call the McDonald's principle. Yes, McDonald's started in USA, but McDonald's Japan is not the same as McDonald's everywhere else. Most of the customers of McDonald's Japan are Japanese. It is in Japan. To say that it is not worth visiting, let alone studying, that we should only pay attention to things that are pure Japanese, whatever that is supposed to mean, would be problematic in my view. So instead of looking at Japanese pop, I'm looking at Western pop in Japan. And that brings us to this phrase. How many times have you heard the phrase big in Japan, whether it's applying to music or something else? It appears to be yet another one of these cliches that gets thrown around in relation to Japan. The phrase itself seems to stick thanks to both a single and a group which had that name. So there was a song by Alphaville called Big in Japan. There was actually also a group called Big in Japan, both from the 70s. But in many respects, the phrase began as an insult. Being big in Japan actually implied not being big anywhere else. Some started to break this mold and finally became big back in their own country. And one of the best examples of this is actually Bon Jovi. But there was also an implication that being big in Japan was a sign that an act was no longer merely domestic or restricted to that country or continent. So my study would be looking at some Western pop acts in Japan. But who? Well, first I wanted to restrict the study to acts that became popular in the 80s and 90s, prior to digital download music. And overall, I decided to look at 5. And I chose them because I'm aware that all of them have had Japanese releases. They've had some sort of, and quite often had some sort of Japanese influence in some of their music. So there's Berlin, who are from the USA, best known, of course, for the song Take My Breath Away in the movie Top Gun, but a group are still going, albeit they stopped for a bit during the 1990s, and are typical of the sort of the new wave genre that came out in the 80s. There's the British group, the Pet Shop Boys, well known for their electronic music and still very active. Thompson Twins, another essentially British group, albeit with one New Zealander. Again, new wave, but also stopped early 90s. And Roxette, who are from Sweden, who are sort of pop rock type music. But the main group that I'm looking at, and the one which I'm going to be concentrating on today, is another group. Ladies and gentlemen, let me present Frankie Goes to Hollywood. 5 members, as you can see, all from Liverpool. And just as a little bit of an extra twist to the story here, Holly Johnson, the lead singer of Frankie Goes to Hollywood, was actually in the group called Big in Japan. So a nice little overlap there. Now, some of you may not be familiar with Frankie, and I will quite often just abbreviate the name down to Frankie. So let me introduce the key elements. In 1984, Frankie Goes to Hollywood burst onto the world stage. The first single, Relax, reached #1, spawning a plethora of 12-inch remixes and helped to launch the ubiquitous Frankie Say t-shirts. Relax's cover and content were nearly as outrageous as the group itself, including its 2 openly gay members. The second single, Two Tribes, about the threat of nuclear war, shot straight to #1, where it stayed for an incredible 9 weeks. An extraordinary double album, Welcome to the Pleasure Dome, followed, and the group got their 3rd #1 single, The Power of Love, soon after. And it was still 1984. Well, Frankie would release 4 more singles, another album, Liverpool, and go on 2 tours. They could never match the heights of 1984. For many, Frankie slipped from memory, but not everyone. As you may have started to spot on the previous slide, symbols were a feature of the Frankie marketing. Not only was there a logo for the band, but also for the first 4 singles and album. Even on the second album, symbols were used, though more relating to the band members than the tracks. This may well have sparked my initial interest in symbols, which has led many years later to me being interested in Kamon, these family crests that you can see at the bottom there that they use in Japan, as well as symbols and symbolism more broadly in Japan. During their 3 main years of existence, Frankie did a range of touring, including a world tour and a European tour. From the perspective of those of us interested in Japan, it is notable that the only non-European or North American country that they visited was Japan in 1985. In relation to my Japan connections with Frankie, there are a variety of stories to tell. First, although the group split up in 1987, in 1993, a greatest hits album, Bang, was released. I was in Japan at the time on the JET program. Looking at the diary that I kept during my year on JET, it's the only time I've kept a diary, it looks like I picked up my copy of the album during a weekend break in Kyoto, although I may have bought it in Nagoya, close to where I lived, at a small record shop that I often stopped on my way back to my place. While there's nothing particularly new about the collection, you have to keep in mind that this was a time when it was hard to record onto a CD yourself. Minidisc had not yet appeared, let alone MP3. So many of us still recorded things onto tapes to listen to in the car, for example, or had to rely on the originally produced CDs for the choice of music. Bang, therefore, took care of the issue of having Frankie's top songs, or at least most well-known ones, split across 2 separate CDs. My next Frankie moment in Japan happened on the 26th of April, 1994, while I was still on JET. I was at a party in the city where I was based, Seto. One of the attendees turned up with Two Tribes, my favorite Frankie track, blasting from his car. I'd not heard Frankie being played in Japan except from my own speakers before. Sadly, that night would become memorable for a completely different reason. Just a few kilometers from where we were, at Nagoya Airport, China Airlines flight CI-140 crashed, killing 264 of the 271 on board in Japan's second worst aviation accident after the JL123 crash of 1985. Little could I imagine that the scenes that I watched on TV that evening would become part of my academic research about 12 years later, or indeed that the playing of two tribes would do so a further 14 years later. Upon finishing JET, I returned to the UK and went back to Sheffield, where I graduated from, and went on to start a PhD. Upon starting at the university again, I was given details about how to access something called the internet and use something called an email. I'd not heard of such things before. This had come about literally in the 12 months while I was out of Britain and out of Sheffield University, and I don't remember having come across them really in Japan either, certainly not at the schools. Anyway, I remember writing my first email and then starting to find out what could be done on the internet. I have a distinct memory of one thing that I did. Having discovered that you could search newspapers, I went to check whether Holly Johnson, the lead singer of Frankie, was alive or not, as I knew he'd gone public about him being HIV positive. There didn't appear to be any reports of his death, but there also was no mention of his autobiography, which was published around this time. These were still days before Amazon even, so it would be some years before I would get a copy of the book myself. Let's roll forward about a decade, certainly a few years. By now I was at Cardiff University, heading up the Cardiff Japanese Studies Centre and primarily conducting research related to the symbolism of the Shinkansen, which Mike, I'm sure, particularly remembers and enjoys. I can see you smiling away there. During this time, I had a Japanese mobile phone account that I used exclusively while in Japan. Over the years, the phone itself evolved. It was always fun getting the updated phone, usually much nicer than what I had back in the UK, how things have changed. And I would adorn it with straps relating to the Shinkansen and Hanshin Tigers baseball team, which I support. The other thing was to sort out a ringtone. On one of these phones, I was pleasantly surprised to discover that one of the few available ringtones was a polyphonic version of Relax by Frankie. I never did figure out how to get that onto my phone back in the UK. And now let's start bringing the story right up to date. During the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns, the musician Tim Burgess set up Tim's Twitter listening parties, where fans would listen to the same album at the same time and tweet about it. Pure nostalgia overload. Anyway, one was held for Welcome to the Pleasure Dome. The experience helped light a spark. I realized that there could be a way to write a book relating to Frankie fans rather than a history of the group themselves. I'd finished my second novel, Tokyo 2020 Vision, earlier that year, and was making good progress on the next one, 4. As I knew I wouldn't start on the following one until the summer of 2021, that reminds me I'm due to start work on it in a week's time, I could see that there was a window to start working on and do work on a book about Frankie. So I began jotting down my own ideas and also encouraging fans to take part in a survey, which I put together so that I could gather more stories, bits of nostalgia, etc. One thing that I was aware of from being on some Facebook groups was there was a lot of interest in the Japanese releases of Frankie albums. This, coupled with the experience of Frankie that I'd had in Japan and that Frankie had been to Japan, led me to think that Frankie had been big in Japan. With my Japan links, I thought it would be obvious, therefore, to do a chapter or a part of the book about Frankie and Japan. So I started by checking the stats about how they'd done in the charts, etc. And what I discovered was they were not big in Japan. There was no sign of hit singles or albums. This was a bit of a surprise. So I consulted a friend who works in the music industry in Japan, who said that Western music, other than a few household names like Madonna and Michael Jackson, were never big in Japan. Surely not, I thought. He must be wrong. So I began to look for more information on this and soon discovered there was an academic article on the subject, Not So Big in Japan, Western Pop Music in the Japanese Market by Guy De Launey, and published in 1995 in the journal Popular Music. This confirmed everything that my friend had told me. About 90% of sales in Japan, and physical sales still dominate today, let alone during the period I am most interested in, 90% of the sales are for Japanese domestic acts. The Western acts are fighting over just 10%, albeit of one of the largest music markets on the planet. I then followed this up by getting in touch with De Launey and interviewing him via Zoom. He then introduced me to a couple of Japanese friends who helped to explain a bit more about the pop music scene in Japan and what it was like for Japanese people who wanted to listen to Western music. Three things stood out from this. First, reading magazines and learning about new Western acts from friends, particularly those who worked in record shops, was key. Second, listening to Western pop for many Japanese people relates to escapism and feeling that domestic music seems unoriginal, which is perhaps comparable to how many Japanese studies students and staff feel in relation to J-pop, and dare I say K-pop. Third was the love of lyric sheets, which in the case of releases by Western acts would include a translation of the lyrics also. This would often mean that the release would be delayed and be more expensive compared to the original release. But the additional benefit of waiting and paying extra was the Japanese release would often contain some exclusive tracks. You can imagine already why the Japanese releases would become attractive to collectors outside of Japan. Thanks to De Launey, I've also been in contact with the former head of Tower Records Japan, who has provided further insights about the Japanese market. All of this led to the next natural step, for me to get hold of some of these magazines and Japanese releases of Frankie music for myself. Although some Frankie fans did scan the lyric sheets for me and send them to me before I decided to get my own copies. Thanks to auction sites and being able to read Japanese, all of this was a relatively straightforward process, and I was able to get these magazines and records much cheaper than I would do in the UK, where the Japanese releases regularly reach 4 to 5 times their original retail price, and sometimes even more. The main complication was how long it took for the items to arrive after they were sent from Japan, thanks to the pandemic's impact on the transportation sector. I got hold of copies of 4 different titles: Takarajima, Music Life, Rockin' On, and FM Shukan. The first thing I noticed about Takarajima, which is also known as Wonderland, of which I have 2 issues, is how thick it is. Both copies have 226 pages, predominantly paper. Compared to magazines that I was getting back in the 1980s, like Smash Hits and Number One, the difference is really apparent. Rather, Takarajima is much more like your standard Japanese monthly magazine. The pages aren't that big, but there are a lot of them, and there's a lot of text with feature articles and interviews. There are also a lot of photographs. But the magazine isn't just about music, with articles on food, fashion, and so on as well. There's even some manga in there. In one, there's an article about when Frankie comes to Tokyo, including some photos of concerts there and a picture of the band in which Brian Nash looks particularly relaxed. The other has an article dealing with some aspects of the band and an interview with Paul Rutherford. Music Life, for which I also have 2 editions, is even bigger than Takarajima. Again, it is a monthly magazine, but the pages are bigger and there are over 300 of them, about half of which are glossy, the rest being standard paper. Unlike Takarajima, this magazine opens and works with the pages as a British magazine would, rather than the more traditional and, in my view, easier to turn version. So you're going from sort of front to back in the standard order for a Western magazine. Music Life is purely focused on music, with a range of articles, photographs, interviews, and even a page of stickers. In terms of Frankie, in one, there are some photos taken by 3 Japanese photographers of a concert in London in early 1985, whilst in the other, there is an article featuring an interview with all the band members of when Frankie were in Japan. And the photos look as though they were taken at the same place as the Takarajima photo shoot I mentioned earlier. Compared to the previous 2, the monthly magazine Rockin' On has noticeably less pages. Although the page size is the same as Music Life, there are only about 120 of them. I say only, this is still a lot of pages. Though at an original retail price of 280 yen, which even if the current exchange rate is less than £2 and would have been much less back in 1985. And keep in mind, of course, Japan has had almost no inflation in the intervening 30-something years. And so it is a very good value magazine. Just for comparison, Takarajima and Music Life retailed at 350 and 550 yen, respectively. I only have 1 copy of Rockin' On. It has a fairly even split between paper and glossy pages, with a range of articles, interviews, and pictures. There also seem to be a lot of adverts, which of course feature in all the other magazines too, but seem particularly high in this one. The magazine predominantly works in the traditional right to left order, although two-page articles are sometimes left to right just to keep readers on their toes. In terms of Frankie, there is an article, the first article in the magazine, that appears to be a translation from the Daily Mirror syndication, which is presumably chosen to be published to coincide with when Frankie would be in Japan. The final magazine is FM Shukan, a weekly magazine that retailed at 220 yen and is read from right to left. I have 3 editions of this magazine. Although the pages are the same height as Music Life and Rocking On, it is slightly wider. Despite being a weekly magazine, it still runs to at around 130 pages, although the last 30 pages of this primarily details TV and radio listings. FM Shukan seems to be only concerned with music and has a range of articles, interviews and photographs on a combination of paper and glossy pictures. In terms of Frankie, the first one has a short article with photos of a concert in London and confirmation that they would be touring Japan. The second has Frankie on the front cover, most of the band looking a bit jet-lagged and a bit sort of at least worn out, let's say, as well as an article including interviews and photos. This includes a list of the most popular questions which readers wanted to ask the band and subsequent answers. Some things from my book here. The final edition is from 1986, and the part on Frankie relates to the release of their second album, Liverpool, in a section called Big Star. It includes a large picture of the band in concert with the chorus of Rage Hard included. I mention this purely because as I was looking at this magazine, coincidentally, Rage Hard started playing on my computer, and I promise I don't only listen to Frankie Goes to Hollywood. Other than the few lyrics mentioned above, compared to British pop magazines, one thing that stands out from all 4 magazines is the lack of song lyrics, but I wasn't expecting to find any since they tend to appear with the releases themselves. Let us turn to the music. The first thing I did was go and check my copy of Bang. I discovered that it was not the Japanese release, so I must have bought it from somewhere that sold the imports, though I still don't remember which shop this was. I was going to need to get a Japanese version of the album. Notice the word need. It really did feel like a need rather than a want. And it turned out my hunting was very successful. I managed to get at least 1 copy of each of the singles and albums in one format or another, as well as the CDs, taking account of some of the reissues and remixes, and that there are often more than 1 version of each album, as it may have been different design label, different color vinyl, etc. I know I don't have the whole set, but it was a start, and it was certainly sufficient for the more academic aspect of my need for them, checking the lyrics, for example. And in relation to this, my main takeaway at the moment, out of all the various Frankie releases, there is only 1 song for which the Japanese translation never appears. On the albums, the tracks even skip over this song, so it goes from listing track 1 to track 3, for example. Missing track? Relax. I imagine there would have been some interesting discussions about the content and how to translating it, keeping in mind how come would have to become iku, which actually means go, and whether it would be appropriate to include it or not. It's perhaps surprising the cover of the single wasn't also changed. As well as music, I managed to get a rare poster and also copies of both the Japanese and second UK European tour programs, both for less than what I would have to have paid if I bought them on eBay in the UK. But these weren't the only Frankie-related items I got. Yeah, in some ways I hope you couldn't hear that, but anyway, let's stop that and kill the pain. That song apparently uses relax. Whatever. Returning to more authentic Frankie items, the Japanese record label Polystar, which distributed Frankie records in Japan, also set up a fan club, abbreviated down to FC, called DARE. Here are some of the covers and inside pages kindly scanned and sent to me by Frankie fan Takuya Terasawa. I hope to get a chance to see all the content sometime and do some additional analysis on them. The first edition of Dare even had a translation of the lyrics for Relax, the only time there's been anything close to an official Japanese translation. Returning to Frankie themselves, as I noted earlier, they toured to Japan in 1985. This actually came up in my book, Osutaka, which largely works around the diary of Peter Matthew and his experience relating his son Kimball and Kim's fiancée Masako being victims of the JL123 crash. In one of the final letters that Kim sent to Peter, he mentioned that he was planning on seeing Frankie live in Osaka that summer. In addition to the previously mentioned resources, I've also been gathering information in other ways. Brian Nasher has written an autobiography. The British Music Experience in Liverpool is running a special exhibition for 6 months all about Frankie, which I plan to visit later this summer. I also hope to interview members of the band and possibly others involved with the Frankie story over the coming months, although in some ways they are not central to how the book is planned. And also the survey is going very well so far. I've had about 100 responses so far, the average time being taken a staggering 35 minutes, revealing just how detailed the responses are likely to be. In relation to live concerts in Japan, I've heard many people, particularly Westerners and Western groups, comment on how polite Japanese fans are. They sit down and they don't sing along, etc., etc. I've only been to one concert in Japan, seeing U2 in Saitama, and my experience really didn't match with the widely portrayed image. And despite what Nasher writes in his book, I'm not convinced it happened with the Frankie concerts either. I have a bootleg copy of a recording of one of the Tokyo concerts, and it's easy to hear the fans, predominantly female teenagers by the sound of things, which is also true of bootleg recordings from other concerts around Britain and Europe, screaming throughout the concert and obviously particularly between songs. The book is continuing to grow. Much like my first book on the JL123 crash, it seems that the more I put into it, the more I get out of it. The plan was to have the book finished and released in autumn 2021. It is likely that this will need to be postponed, and there's still so much I can do with it. On an academic side, there are a few things that stand out for me. First, the issue of autoethnography is so central to all of this. Second, the power of nostalgia, a concept that in the English-speaking world historically was seen as an illness, hence the "ja" ending to the word, but in Japan is seen as such a positive term with the word natsukashi. More needs to be done to look at nostalgia and how it may be becoming more powerful in the world and the impact that this can have on memory studies. Finally, I'm discovering there is much more to the story of pop music in Japan than I expected. Returning to the title, Two Tribes, the tribes are not English and Japanese. They are those who like Western pop and those who do not. Ultimately, this is likely to be one of the defining features of the research, regardless of which act is the focus or any autoethnographic element. Nationality, ethnicity, and such like are not the key distinguishing factor. But that is not to say that there are no differences in how fans of Western pop in the UK and Japan, for example, follow their groups. But they are more united than disunited or different. Thank you very much for listening.